Have you ever wondered what would happen if, while you slept, someone quietly changed your life forever? Long ago, in a forgotten village surrounded by ancient forests, there lived a poor shoemaker who had almost lost everything. His money was gone, his shop was empty, and on one cold winter night, he was left with only a single piece of leather, just enough to make one final pair of shoes. But by the next morning, the leather had vanished. In its place stood the most beautiful pair of shoes anyone had ever seen. Who made them? No one had entered the workshop. No one had opened the door. Yet every night, the miracle happened again. As whispers spread through the village, the shoemaker realized that someone, hidden beneath the moonlight, was working in secret, asking for nothing in return. This is not just a fairy tale about magic. It is a timeless story about kindness, gratitude, hope, and the extraordinary miracles that can grow from the smallest acts of generosity. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and join me as we journey into one of the most beloved tales ever told. Today, I'm telling story of the Elves and the Shoemaker. The last piece of leather. Long ago, in a quiet valley surrounded by green hills and whispering forests, there stood a tiny village where life moved slowly with the changing seasons. Narrow stone roads wound between small cottages with thatched roofs. Gardens bloomed with colorful flowers during spring, and gentle streams carried crystal clear water through the countryside. The people of the village believed in many old stories. They believed that every forest held ancient secrets. They believed that every river remembered forgotten songs. They believed that the stars watched over honest people. And above all, they believed that kindness was never forgotten. At the very edge of the village, beside an old oak tree that had stood for hundreds of years, lived a humble shoemaker named Thomas. Thomas was not famous. He was not wealthy. He did not own a large workshop or employ many workers. Instead, he lived quietly with his loving wife, Margaret, in a tiny cottage with a small wooden shop built onto the front. Every morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached the village rooftops, Thomas would light a candle, place his worn leather apron over his shoulders, and sit at his workbench. His tools had been with him for many years: a polished wooden hammer, sharp knives, strong needles, waxed thread, small brass nails. Each tool carried scratches from years of careful work. Thomas treated every piece of leather with respect, as though it were a precious treasure. He believed every pair of shoes should be made with patience. A shoe, he often said, must carry not only the feet, but also the hopes of the traveler. His customers admired his craftsmanship. They knew that shoes made by Thomas lasted for many years. Farmers wore them through muddy fields. Merchants traveled long roads wearing them. Children ran through forests wearing them. Even elderly villagers smiled proudly while walking in shoes made by his gentle hands. Yet despite his talent, Thomas remained poor. Very poor. He never charged more than people could afford. If a widow needed shoes for winter, he quietly accepted half the payment. If a child had no money at all, Thomas sometimes made the shoes for free. Margaret would gently remind him, "My dear, generosity fills the heart, but it does not always fill the cupboard." Thomas would smile, "I know, but cold feet should never belong to good people." Margaret loved him even more because of that answer. She never complained. Although life was difficult, they faced every challenge together. Each evening they shared simple meals: a bowl of warm soup, fresh bread when they could afford flour, sometimes cheese, sometimes only potatoes. Yet before every meal they held hands. They thanked heaven for another day. They thanked each other, and they hoped tomorrow might be a little brighter. Years passed this way. Some years were kind, others were harsh. Heavy rains ruined crops. Long winters kept travelers away. Fewer customers visited the little shop. Money slowly disappeared. One by one, Thomas sold many of his belongings. First went the extra workbench, then the spare tools, then an old cabinet. Finally, only the essentials remained. Margaret secretly repaired her own dresses over and over again. She carefully patched Thomas's coat each winter. Neither wished the other to worry, but both knew the truth. They were running out of everything. One cold autumn afternoon, Thomas opened his wooden chest where he stored leather. It was nearly empty. He searched every corner. Nothing. Only one final piece remained, just enough to make a single pair of shoes. Thomas gently lifted the leather into the light. He ran his fingers across its smooth surface. "It is beautiful leather," he whispered. "The finest I have ever owned." Margaret stood beside him. "So, this is our last chance." Thomas nodded. "If these shoes sell, perhaps we can buy more leather. And if they do not—" He remained silent. Outside, the wind carried golden leaves across the road. The old oak tree creaked softly. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed across the valley. Thomas took a deep breath. He carefully measured the leather. Every cut had to be perfect. There could be no mistakes. Slowly, patiently, he marked every piece. The left shoe, the right shoe, the tongue, the heel, the lining. When evening arrived, everything was prepared, but the stitching would have to wait until morning. His tired eyes could barely stay open. "It is too dark," Margaret said gently. "You have worked enough." Thomas looked at the unfinished leather. "I wish I could finish tonight." "You always say, 'Tired hands make careless stitches,'" Thomas smiled. "You remember my own lessons." "I always do." He carefully arranged every piece upon his workbench. The candle flickered softly beside them. Margaret closed the shop windows. Thomas placed his tools neatly in their places. Before leaving the workshop, he looked one last time at the carefully cut leather. "I pray these become the finest shoes I have ever made." Margaret squeezed his hand. "And I pray someone who truly needs them will find them." Together they blew out the candle. Darkness quietly filled the workshop. Outside, the moon climbed high above the sleeping village. Silver light covered rooftops. Owls called from the forest. The wind whispered through the branches of the old oak tree. Inside the silent workshop, nothing moved, or so it seemed. As midnight approached, a tiny sound echoed across the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. It was so soft, almost impossible to hear. Then another, tiny footsteps, light as falling leaves. A faint giggle floated through the darkness. Another answered. Little shadows slipped beneath the workshop door. No taller than a teapot, swift as moonlight, silent as snow. Small hands reached toward the unfinished leather. Bright little eyes sparkled in the pale moonlight. Without speaking, they smiled. One picked up the tiny hammer. Another threaded a delicate needle. A third carefully examined Thomas's patterns with admiration. Then, as the stars shone brightly over the quiet village, the mysterious work quietly began. And before dawn broke across the valley, nothing inside the little workshop would ever be the same again. The miracle at dawn. The first light of morning spread gently across the valley. Golden rays slipped over the hills, painted the rooftops with soft amber light, and awakened the little village from its peaceful sleep. Roosters crowed in the distance. Birds sang from the branches of the old oak tree. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and damp earth through the narrow streets. Inside the little cottage, Thomas awoke before sunrise, just as he always did. For a moment, he lay quietly, listening to the familiar sounds of morning. Then he remembered. The leather, his final piece of leather. The unfinished shoes waiting upon his workbench. He sighed softly. "I must finish them today." Margaret smiled warmly as she prepared a small pot of tea. "You rested well." "I hope so," Thomas replied. "These shoes must be the finest I have ever made." She handed him a simple breakfast of bread and warm tea. "Then go," she said gently. "I have faith in your hands." Thomas kissed her forehead. "And I have faith in your heart." Together, they stepped into the little workshop. The room was quiet. The morning sunlight streamed through the window. Dust danced lazily in the golden beams. Everything seemed exactly as they had left it the night before. The tools rested neatly upon the bench. The chair remained tucked beneath the table. The candle had burned itself into a small pool of hardened wax. Nothing appeared unusual until Thomas looked toward the center of his workbench. He stopped walking. His eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. The pieces of leather were gone. In their place sat the most beautiful pair of shoes he had ever seen. For several long moments, he simply stared. Margaret stepped beside him. "What is it?" Thomas slowly pointed. She looked, then covered her mouth in astonishment. Oh, the shoes gleamed in the morning light. Every stitch was perfectly even. Every seam was flawless. The leather curved with elegant precision. The soles fit together so perfectly that they seemed carved from a single piece. The tiny brass nails reflected the sunlight like little stars. Thomas carefully lifted one shoe into his hands. His fingers trembled. He turned it slowly, examining every detail. "The stitching," he whispered. "It is perfect." He looked inside. The lining lay smooth and wrinkle-free. The edges had been polished until they felt as soft as silk. Even the smallest decorative cuts had been shaped with extraordinary skill. Thomas shook his head. I could never have made shoes this beautiful. Margaret gently touched the leather. Neither could I. They searched the workshop. No windows had been opened. The door was still locked from inside. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been disturbed. It was as though invisible hands had quietly entered during the night, completed the work, and vanished before sunrise. Thomas sat slowly upon his chair. I do not understand. Margaret looked thoughtfully around the room. My grandmother used to tell stories. What stories? Stories about little folk, Thomas smiled politely. The old fairy tales? She nodded. They help those with kind hearts, Thomas chuckled softly. I fear hunger has made us imagine impossible things. But the shoes are real. He looked again. Indeed, they were wonderfully real. That morning, Thomas carefully placed the finished shoes in the front window of his shop. They shone brighter than anything else inside. Their polished leather seemed almost alive beneath the morning sunlight. Hours passed quietly. Only a few villagers wandered through the marketplace. Business had been slow for many weeks. Thomas waited patiently. Around midday, a richly dressed traveler entered the shop. His long coat was lined with fine fur. A silver walking cane rested in his hand. His boots were dusty from many miles of travel. Good afternoon, the traveler said. Thomas bowed respectfully. Welcome, sir. The gentleman looked around the modest workshop. His eyes settled immediately upon the shoes. He walked toward them slowly, then stopped. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he smiled. I have purchased shoes in great cities. He lifted one gently. I have visited royal markets. He examined the stitching. I have seen the work of famous craftsmen. He looked directly at Thomas. But I have never seen shoes like these. Thomas lowered his eyes humbly. I am honored by your words. The traveler slipped the shoes onto his feet. They fit perfectly. He walked across the wooden floor. No creaking, no discomfort, only smooth, effortless steps. He laughed with delight. It feels as though they were made especially for me. Thomas smiled. I am pleased they fit. The traveler reached into his leather purse. Instead of placing a few coins upon the table, he laid down a heavy pouch filled with shining gold pieces. Thomas blinked. Sir, this is far too much. The traveler shook his head. No? He looked once more at the shoes. They are worth every coin. Thomas hesitated. I cannot accept such generosity. You can. The traveler smiled kindly. Because true craftsmanship deserves true reward. With that, he picked up his walking cane. Continue making shoes like these. The world needs honest craftsmen. Then he departed. The tiny bell above the door rang softly. Silence returned. Thomas slowly opened the pouch. Gold. More gold than he had held in many years. Margaret stared in disbelief. This, she whispered, this is enough to buy leather for months. Thomas nodded slowly. And enough food for the winter. Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes. She clasped her husband's hands tightly. We prayed for help. Thomas looked toward the bright morning sky beyond the window. And somehow, help arrived. That very afternoon, Thomas walked to the leather merchant in the neighboring town. For the first time in many months, he bought several fine hides, soft calfskin, strong cowhide, elegant brown leather, deep black leather, rich chestnut leather. The merchant smiled warmly. It is good to see you again, Thomas. I hope to return often. So do I. When Thomas carried the leather home, Margaret's face glowed with happiness. Together they placed every roll carefully inside the workshop. Thomas smiled. We have enough to make many pairs. Margaret nodded. And perhaps enough to begin again. As evening approached, Thomas prepared 2 new pairs of shoes. Every measurement was careful, every pattern precise. He arranged every cut piece neatly upon the workbench, just as he had done before. When everything was ready, he quietly stepped back. Margaret looked at him with curious eyes. You are leaving them unfinished? Thomas smiled mysteriously. Only for tonight. She understood immediately. You wish to see what happens? I do. They shared supper beside the fireplace. Neither spoke much. Both wondered the same thing. Would the miracle happen again? Or had it been only a single mysterious blessing? Outside, darkness settled gently across the valley. Stars filled the heavens one by one. The village grew silent. Candles disappeared behind shuttered windows. The old oak tree swayed peacefully beneath the moonlight. Thomas and Margaret climbed into bed. But sleep came slowly. Every little sound made Thomas open his eyes. Every creak of the cottage made Margaret hold her breath. Somewhere beyond the workshop walls, the wind whispered softly. Then, long after midnight, very faintly, almost too softly to hear. There came a tiny sound, tap, 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 followed by cheerful little laughter, not frightening, not cruel, but joyful, as though unseen friends had returned once more. Thomas opened his eyes. Margaret looked at him. Neither spoke. They listened. The tiny sounds continued. The faint tapping of miniature hammers, the whisper of thread passing through leather, the soft scrape of little shoes across the wooden floor. Neither dared to move. Neither dared to peek through the workshop door. For somehow, both knew, some mysteries were gifts meant to be trusted, not disturbed. And while the village slept peacefully beneath the silver moon, the unseen workers continued their marvelous craft, preparing another miracle before the break of dawn. The secret hands of the night. Morning came wrapped in soft golden light. The eastern sky glowed with shades of pink and amber as the first rays of the sun reached the little village. Dew sparkled like tiny diamonds upon the grass, and birds welcomed the new day with cheerful songs. Inside the cottage, Thomas and Margaret were already awake. Neither of them had slept deeply. Again and again, they had heard the faint tapping during the night, tiny footsteps, soft laughter, the gentle rhythm of careful work. Yet, they had kept their promise to themselves. They had not looked. They had not opened a workshop door. Some mysteries, they believed, deserved respect. Thomas quietly dressed and lit a small lantern. Although daylight was already filling the room, he felt strangely nervous. Margaret smiled. "Whatever awaits us, we shall face it together." Thomas nodded. As always, slowly, he reached for the workshop door. The old hinges creaked softly. Sunlight poured inside. For one silent moment, neither of them spoke. There, resting upon the workbench, were two magnificent pairs of shoes, even more beautiful than the first. Thomas stepped closer. His heart was pounding. One pair was made of deep brown leather, polished until it reflected the morning light like calm water. The other pair was black, elegant, and perfectly balanced. Every stitch was straight, every edge smooth, every lace woven with remarkable care. Thomas gently picked up one shoe. Again, he searched for a single mistake, one uneven stitch, one crooked seam, one tiny flaw. There was none. "It is impossible," he whispered. Margaret smiled softly. "No." She looked around the quiet workshop. "I believe it is kindness returning to kindness." Thomas looked thoughtfully at the shoes. "Whoever made these, they possess extraordinary skill and extraordinary hearts." That morning, Thomas placed both pairs in the shop window. Before long, villagers began to notice. A farmer passing with his horse stopped in surprise. "My word, I have never seen finer boots." Soon, a young teacher entered. She admired the graceful stitching and purchased the smaller pair for her elderly father. Not long afterward, a merchant traveling through the valley noticed the black shoes. He tried them on. They fit perfectly. Without hesitation, he paid twice the usual price. By sunset, both pairs had been sold. Thomas counted the coins carefully. There was enough money to buy even more leather, enough to repair the cottage roof, enough to keep food upon the table for many weeks. For the first time in many months, hope returned to the little home. As the days passed, the same miracle happened again. Every evening Thomas carefully measured and cut new pieces of leather. Every night, he arranged them neatly upon the workbench. Every morning, beautiful shoes waited where unfinished leather had been. Word spread quickly throughout the valley. The shoemaker has become a master. No one crafts shoes like Thomas. They are the finest in the kingdom. Customers began arriving from neighboring villages. Some traveled for hours, some for entire days. Carriages stopped outside the little shop from dawn until dusk. Thomas greeted everyone with kindness. He never boasted. He never claimed to possess magical talent. Whenever customers praised him, he simply smiled. "I am grateful you enjoy my work." Yet deep inside, he carried a quiet secret. One afternoon, an elderly woman entered the shop. Her walking stick tapped gently against the wooden floor. She studied the shoes with wise old eyes. Then she smiled knowingly. "These shoes carry joy." Thomas looked surprised. "What do you mean?" She gently touched one polished boot. "There are craftsmen who work with their hands. There are craftsmen who work with their minds. And once in a very great while," she paused, "there are craftsmen whose work is blessed." Thomas remained silent. The old woman purchased a pair of sturdy boots. Before leaving, she turned once more. "Never forget gratitude. Blessings often visit quietly." Then she disappeared into the busy street. Her words stayed with Thomas for the rest of the day. That evening, while the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. Margaret looked across the room. "You have been thinking," Thomas nodded. "I wonder, what kind of beings help us?" Margaret smiled gently. "My grandmother believed there are little people who live between the roots of ancient trees. They appear only to those with honest hearts. They ask for nothing. They simply help where goodness lives." Thomas stared into the dancing flames. "If that is true, then how can we ever thank them?" Margaret had no answer. Silence settled over the room. Outside, snowflakes began drifting from the dark winter sky. The first snowfall of the season. The village slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Children laughed as they chased one another through the streets. Smoke curled from chimneys. Warm lights glowed behind frosted windows. Inside the workshop, Thomas carefully prepared 4 new pairs of shoes, winter boots, strong soles, thick leather, warm linings. He laid every piece neatly upon the bench. Then he stood quietly, looking around the room. Without speaking, he straightened his tools. He swept the wooden floor. He placed fresh candles nearby. He even left a small loaf of warm bread upon the table. Margaret noticed. "You think they might be hungry?" Thomas smiled. "I do not know. But if guests visit my workshop every night, it seems only right to offer them something." Later that evening, they finished supper and quietly retired for the night. Outside, snow continued to fall. The world became wonderfully silent. The old oak tree stood covered in white. Its branches sparkled beneath the moonlight. Midnight came. Once again, tiny footsteps echoed through the workshop. Tap, tap, tap. Gentle laughter followed. Little voices whispered so softly that they sounded almost like the wind itself. Thomas opened his eyes. He listened carefully. The sounds were cheerful, busy, almost musical. Then, something unexpected happened. The tapping stopped. Complete silence filled the cottage. Thomas frowned. "Why have they stopped?" Margaret whispered. "Perhaps they found something." Several long moments passed. Then, the tiny laughter returned, lighter than before. As though whoever worked in the workshop had discovered a pleasant surprise, Thomas smiled quietly beneath his blanket. "The bread." Margaret nodded. "They found your gift." The little sounds continued until nearly dawn. Not once did Thomas or Margaret leave their bed. They wished to honor the trust that had quietly grown between them and their unseen helpers. When morning finally arrived, Thomas hurried to the workshop. The bread was gone. Not even a crumb remained. Beside the empty wooden plate, someone had placed a tiny white flower, no larger than a daisy. Its petals shimmered with delicate frost, though it did not melt in the warmth of the room. Thomas picked it up with great care. "It wasn't here yesterday." Margaret smiled. "No, it is their way of saying thank you." Thomas placed the little flower inside a small glass bottle upon the windowsill. Whenever the sunlight touched it, the petals seemed to glow with a soft silver light. He looked around the workshop. 4 magnificent pairs of boots stood waiting, the finest work yet. Thomas folded his hands and quietly bowed his head. He did not know the names of his mysterious friends. He did not know where they came from. But every morning, his gratitude grew deeper. Little did he know, the time was drawing near when he and Margaret would finally discover the tiny hands that had changed their lives forever. The longest night. Winter settled gently over the valley. Every rooftop was covered with a blanket of white snow. Icicles hung from the eaves of cottages like crystal ornaments, and the frozen stream sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. The days had grown short, the evenings arrived early, and each night, the stars seemed brighter than ever before. The little village was preparing for Christmas. Children hurried through the snowy streets, carrying bundles of evergreen branches. Mothers baked sweet loaves of bread scented with cinnamon and honey. Fathers gathered firewood before another snowfall arrived. Church bells echoed softly through the crisp winter air, reminding everyone that the season of hope had come once again. For Thomas and Margaret, this Christmas felt very different from the one before. Only a few months earlier, they had wondered how they would survive the winter. Now, their shelves were filled with leather. Their pantry held enough food for many weeks. A warm fire burned each evening in the hearth. The roof no longer leaked when snow melted beneath the afternoon sun. Yet despite these blessings, neither Thomas nor Margaret forgot how quickly their fortune had changed. Every night, someone still entered the workshop. Every morning, another masterpiece appeared upon the workbench. Neither of them had ever seen their mysterious helpers, but every day, their gratitude grew stronger. One snowy afternoon, as Thomas polished a newly finished pair of boots, Margaret stood beside the window, watching children laugh, as they built a snowman near the village square. "They must be very small," she said quietly. Thomas looked up. "Who? Our midnight visitors," he smiled. "They leave footprints no larger than a robin's." Margaret nodded. "I noticed them this morning." So did I. For the first time, Thomas had discovered tiny marks in the thin layer of snow outside the workshop door. They were almost too delicate to see. Little footprints, perfectly formed, leading from the old oak tree toward the workshop, and then disappearing beneath the door. He had followed them carefully, but beyond the oak, the tracks simply vanished, as though the wind itself had carried away their owners. Thomas looked thoughtfully toward the ancient tree. "It has watched over this village longer than anyone can remember." Margaret smiled. "My grandmother always believed the oldest trees know the oldest secrets." Thomas chuckled softly. "If that is true, this tree has kept many." That evening, after supper, the couple sat beside the fireplace. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the moonlight. The fire crackled gently. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "Thomas, yes? Do you ever wonder if they are happy?" Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I do. They work every night. They never ask for payment. They never speak. They simply help us." Margaret folded her hands. "I wish we could thank them. So do I." He stared into the dancing flames. "I have thanked heaven every morning, but I have never thanked those little hands." Margaret nodded slowly. "There must be a way." For several minutes, the room remained silent. Then Thomas spoke again. "Tomorrow night." Margaret looked at him. "Let us stay awake." She understood immediately. "You wish to see them, only from a distance. I do not wish to frighten them, nor do I. If they truly come with good intentions, they deserve our respect." Margaret smiled warmly. "Then tomorrow shall be the longest night." The following day was Christmas Eve. The village was alive with quiet celebration. Church bells rang joyfully across the valley. Families greeted one another in the snowy streets. Children carried tiny lanterns from house to house, singing old Christmas songs. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the cold evening air. Thomas closed his workshop early. He carefully swept every corner until the wooden floor gleamed. He polished each of his tools and placed them neatly upon the bench. Then he selected the finest leather he owned. Soft, supple, rich in color. He measured enough pieces for 3 elegant pairs of shoes. Every pattern was perfectly drawn. Every cut was careful. When he had finished, he arranged the leather exactly as he always did. Nothing more, nothing less. Margaret entered carrying 2 small candles. She placed them beside the workbench. "The room feels welcoming," she whispered. Thomas smiled. "I hope they think so." As darkness settled over the valley, the couple enjoyed a quiet Christmas Eve supper. Fresh bread, warm vegetable soup, a little cheese, and a single apple, which they shared between them. Before leaving the table, they joined hands. Thomas bowed his head. "For every blessing we have received," Margaret continued, "and for every friend we have yet to meet." Together they whispered, "Thank you." The fire slowly burned lower. The cottage grew quiet. Instead of going to bed, Thomas and Margaret quietly entered a tiny storage room beside the workshop. A narrow wooden wall separated the 2 rooms. Between the old planks was a tiny crack, just large enough to see the workbench, just large enough to watch. Without being seen, Thomas extinguished every candle except one. Its gentle flame cast a warm golden circle across the leather waiting on the table. Then, silence. Minutes passed. Outside, snow continued to fall. The church bell struck midnight. 1, 2, 3 slow echoes drifted through the frozen valley. Then, from somewhere beyond the old oak tree, a sound floated through the winter night. Tap, tap, tap. Tiny footsteps, growing closer. Margaret gently held Thomas's hand. Neither dared to breathe. The workshop door did not open. The window did not move. Yet somehow, 2 tiny shadows slipped beneath the door as easily as moonlight crossing the floor. Thomas blinked. He could scarcely believe his eyes. Standing in the silver glow of the moon were 2 little elves, no taller than a shoemaker's boot. Their ears were delicately pointed. Their bright eyes sparkled with laughter. Their hair shone like threads of silver beneath the candlelight. They wore little clothes that were patched and faded from long use. Their tiny shirts were full of careful stitches. Their trousers were worn at the knees. Their little shoes were almost completely worn through. One elf stretched happily. "Ah, the leather is ready." The other laughed. "Our favorite workshop." With cheerful smiles, they hurried toward the workbench, completely unaware that, for the very first time, Thomas and Margaret were quietly watching them from the shadows. A gift from grateful hearts. The tiny workshop was filled with warm candlelight. From their hidden place behind the wooden wall, Thomas and Margaret watched in complete silence. Neither dared to move. Neither wished to frighten the remarkable little visitors. The two elves hurried toward the workbench with cheerful smiles. One of them clapped his tiny hands. "Oh, look at this leather! The finest Thomas has ever prepared!" The other laughed merrily. "And he has arranged every piece so neatly. It is a pleasure to work in this workshop." Thomas felt his heart grow warm. "They know my name," he whispered so softly that only Margaret could hear. She smiled gently but kept her eyes fixed upon the little craftsman. The first elf picked up a tiny awl that seemed much too large for his small hands. Yet as soon as he touched it, the tool moved as though it had become as light as a feather. The second elf threaded a needle with astonishing speed. Not a single strand of thread slipped from his fingers. Then, without another word, they began. Their hands became a blur. The leather folded gracefully. The thread danced through tiny holes. The hammer tapped with a rhythm so perfect that it sounded almost like music. Tap, tap, tap. Each gentle strike echoed through the quiet workshop. Thomas had spent 40 years making shoes. He had learned from his father. His father had learned from his grandfather. Yet never, not once, had Thomas seen such skill. The elves worked not with haste, but with effortless joy. Every movement flowed naturally into the next. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no mistakes. It was as though they had made shoes beneath the moonlight for hundreds of years. Margaret watched with tears in her eyes. "They love the work," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "They truly do." One elf carefully polished the leather until it reflected the candlelight like calm water. The other inspected every stitch, smiling with satisfaction whenever he found it perfectly straight. At last, the first elf stretched his tiny arms. "There, a fine night's work." His companion admired the finished shoes. "Thomas will be pleased. I hope these help him through another winter." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. "They have done all of this simply to help us." The two little friends laughed together. Then, before leaving, they carefully placed every tool back, exactly where Thomas always kept it. The hammer returned to its hook. The needles were arranged in their wooden case. The scissors rested neatly upon the bench. Even the scraps of leather were gathered into a tidy pile. Margaret smiled through her tears. "They care for your workshop, as though it were their own." When the elves finally slipped beneath the door and disappeared into the snowy night, Thomas remained motionless. For several minutes, neither he nor Margaret spoke. Only the soft crackling of the dying candle could be heard. At last, Thomas stepped quietly into the workshop. He gently touched one of the finished shoes. "It is real," he whispered. "It was never a dream." Margaret joined him. She looked toward the little footprints left in the fine dust upon the workbench. Then her eyes fell upon something else. A tiny patch, sewn onto the sleeve of one elf's shirt, had caught her attention earlier. It had been stitched again and again. The cloth was thin, frayed, almost worn through. She remembered the second elf's trousers. The knees had been carefully mended many times, and their little shoes, their poor little shoes, the soles had nearly disappeared. Margaret turned toward her husband. "Thomas? Yes? They have given us everything. They ask for nothing. They work through the coldest nights. And yet," she paused, "they have almost nothing for themselves." Thomas lowered his eyes. He remembered the worn sleeves, the patched trousers, the bare places where tiny feet almost touched the frozen ground. His heart ached. "We must do something." Margaret smiled. "I was hoping you would say that." The next morning, after selling another beautiful pair of shoes, Thomas returned home carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Margaret opened it. Inside were the finest materials they had owned in many years. Soft wool, fine linen, bright ribbons, warm velvet, tiny brass buttons, strong thread in every color. Margaret's eyes sparkled. "You wish me to sew?" Thomas nodded. "Not for customers, for friends." Margaret carefully picked up the velvet. "It is wonderfully soft. It should keep them warm." Thomas laughed. "And perhaps they deserve shoes made by a shoemaker." For many days the couple worked in secret. During the daylight hours, Thomas continued making shoes for his customers. But every evening, after supper, another kind of work began. Margaret measured tiny garments using only her memory. A little green jacket, a warm red coat, small woolen trousers, fine white shirts, soft stockings, tiny mittens, a pair of cheerful little caps with delicate feathers. Thomas, meanwhile, crafted 2 pairs of miniature shoes. Though they were no longer than his thumb, he devoted the same care to them as he gave every full-size pair. He polished the leather until it gleamed. He stitched each seam with loving precision. When both pairs were finished, Margaret placed them gently upon the table. "They are perfect," Thomas smiled. "No, they are gifts." As Christmas approached once again, every stitch was completed, every button fastened, every ribbon tied. Margaret folded the tiny clothes with great care. Thomas wrapped the little shoes in soft linen. Together, they looked at the finished presents. The workshop was silent. The fire glowed warmly nearby. Margaret whispered, "Do you think they will like them?" Thomas smiled. "I think they will know they are loved." On Christmas Eve, instead of leaving pieces of leather upon the workbench, Thomas carefully arranged the gifts. The tiny jackets, the little shirts, the warm trousers, the colorful caps, the miniature boots. Everything was placed neatly where the elves would surely see it. Then he lit a single candle. Its golden flame danced softly across the beautiful presents. Margaret slipped her hand into his. "Shall we watch again?" Thomas nodded. "But only long enough to see whether they accept our thanks." Together they returned quietly to their hiding place behind the wooden wall. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly from the dark winter sky. The old oak tree stood silent beneath a blanket of white. The village slept peacefully. Midnight came. The church bell echoed across the valley. 1, 2, 3. Then, from beyond the ancient oak, came the familiar sound. Tap, 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 tiny footsteps. Growing closer, the 2 little elves laughed merrily as they approached the workshop. "Another busy night. I wonder what Thomas has prepared for us this time." Smiling happily, they slipped beneath the door. But the moment they reached the workbench, they stopped. Their bright eyes grew wide with astonishment. The leather was gone. In its place lay the most wonderful surprise either elf had ever seen. The elves' Christmas joy. The little workshop was as quiet as a sleeping forest. A single candle flickered gently upon the workbench, filling the room with a warm golden glow. Outside, snowflakes drifted silently through the moonlit night, covering the village in a blanket of sparkling white. Hidden behind the wooden wall, Thomas and Margaret waited patiently. Their hearts beat with excitement. Neither of them knew how the little elves would react. Would they accept the gifts? Would they be frightened? Would they simply disappear forever? Only time would tell. The familiar sound of tiny footsteps echoed across the floor. Tap, tap, tap. Then came cheerful laughter. The 2 little elves slipped beneath the workshop door, as lightly as drifting snowflakes. The taller elf rubbed his hands together. "Another wonderful night," his companion grinned. "I cannot wait to begin." They hurried toward the workbench and stopped. Both stared silently. The room became completely still. The taller elf blinked. "Where is the leather?" The second elf looked all around the table. "There isn't a single piece." For several moments, neither spoke. Then they noticed the beautifully folded bundles resting in the center of the workbench. The taller elf stepped forward cautiously. "What is this?" His companion gently untied one of the ribbons. The cloth unfolded slowly. Inside lay a tiny green jacket made of the softest velvet. Its golden buttons gleamed in the candlelight. The stitching was neat and strong. Every sleeve was perfectly shaped. The little elf gasped. "It is for me." The second bundle revealed a beautiful crimson coat lined with warm wool. Beside it rested a pair of tiny trousers, carefully sewn with sturdy thread. Next came little white shirts, soft stockings, warm mittens, cheerful caps trimmed with delicate feathers, and finally, 2 shining pairs of miniature leather shoes. The little elves stood speechless. The candlelight reflected in their bright eyes. For the first time since Thomas had seen them, neither elf laughed. Instead, their eyes slowly filled with grateful tears. The shorter elf whispered, "No one has ever made clothes for us." The taller elf carefully picked up the tiny shoes. He turned them gently in his hands. They were made with love. Thomas felt tears gathering in his own eyes. Margaret quietly squeezed his hand. The elves looked around the empty workshop. Though they could not see the couple hidden behind the wall, it was as though they somehow understood. The taller elf smiled warmly. "Our dear Shoemaker, you have discovered our secret." The second elf nodded, and instead of fear, you answered with kindness. Together they carefully removed their old, worn clothing, their patched jackets, their faded shirts, their threadbare trousers, their tiny shoes with cracked soles. One by one, they placed them neatly beside the workbench. Then, they dressed in their new gifts. The green velvet jacket fit perfectly. The crimson coat looked splendid. The little shirts were soft and warm. The stockings hugged their feet comfortably. Finally, each elf slipped into his new leather shoes. They took a few careful steps, then another. Their faces lit up with delight. They fit perfectly. They're wonderful. The taller elf laughed so joyfully that the sound filled the little workshop like the ringing of silver bells. The shorter elf spun around happily. We've never looked so fine. Soon both elves were dancing across the wooden floor. Round and round they twirled. They leaped onto the workbench. They skipped across the windowsill. They balanced upon Thomas's chair. The candlelight shimmered as they laughed together. They sang in cheerful little voices, new coats for winter, new shoes so bright, gifts from good hearts, on Christmas night. Kindness given, kindness grows, like gentle rivers, the whole world knows. Their laughter echoed through the workshop. Even the old wooden walls seemed warmer somehow. At last, the dance slowed. The taller elf climbed onto the workbench. He looked around the little room one final time. So many happy nights, so many beautiful shoes. The second elf nodded quietly. Our work here is finished. Thomas heard those words, and his heart suddenly became heavy. Finished? Did that mean they were leaving? The smaller elf smiled gently. The shoemaker no longer needs our hands. He has hope again. He has customers. He has enough leather. And most importantly, he has never forgotten kindness. The taller elf looked toward the old oak tree outside the window. There are others who need help now. Other lonely hearts. Other honest workers. Other dreams waiting in the darkness. The smaller elf whispered, "Our gifts must travel onward." They both turned toward the hidden wall. Although they could not truly see Thomas and Margaret, they bowed deeply. "Thank you." The words were spoken so softly that they were almost carried away by the wind. But Thomas heard them. Every single word. Margaret wiped away a tear. The taller elf reached into his tiny pocket. He placed something upon the workbench. A single silver thread. It shimmered brighter than moonlight. Brighter than frost. Brighter than freshly fallen snow. It will remind them that miracles begin with generous hearts. The smaller elf smiled. And that no act of kindness is ever forgotten. Together they walked toward the workshop door. They did not hurry. They paused once beside Thomas's favorite hammer. The taller elf gently touched its polished handle. "It has served a good man." The second elf softly stroked the smooth workbench. "This room will always remember laughter." Then, hand in hand, the little elves stepped beneath the door. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Tiny footprints stretched toward the ancient oak tree. The moon shone brightly overhead. The elves reached the great tree. For a brief moment, they turned and waved toward the cottage. Then, as a gentle breeze swept through the branches, their figures slowly faded into the silver light, until nothing remained except 2 rows of tiny footprints, leading into the quiet winter forest. Thomas and Margaret remained hidden for several long minutes. Neither wished to disturb the peaceful silence. Finally, Thomas stepped into the workshop. The gifts were gone. Only the old patched clothes remained neatly folded, and there, upon the workbench, rested the single silver thread. He carefully picked it up. Though it felt lighter than silk, it seemed to glow with a warmth unlike anything he had ever touched. Margaret smiled through her tears. "They're gone," Thomas nodded. "Yes, but somehow," he looked around the workshop, "it doesn't feel like goodbye." Outside, the Christmas bells began to ring. Their joyful sound floated across the snowy valley. And deep within their hearts, Thomas and Margaret knew that this Christmas would remain the most beautiful night of their lives. For they had learned a truth more precious than gold, that the greatest miracles are born not from magic alone, but from gratitude, generosity, and love freely given. A legacy of kindness. Christmas morning arrived with a sky as clear as polished crystal. The snow-covered valley shimmered beneath the golden light of the rising sun. Every rooftop sparkled. Every tree branch wore a coat of silver frost. Smoke curled gently from the chimneys, and the church bells welcomed the new day with joyful music. Inside the little cottage, Thomas and Margaret awoke with peaceful hearts. For the first time in many months, there was no sound of tiny footsteps during the night, no gentle tapping, no cheerful laughter, only the quiet whisper of the winter wind outside. They looked at one another and smiled. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. They both understood. Their little friends had begun a new journey. After a simple breakfast, Thomas unlocked the workshop door. Warm sunlight poured inside. Everything was neat. Everything was exactly as they had left it after the elves' farewell. The polished tools rested upon their hooks. The wooden floor gleamed. The familiar scent of fresh leather filled the room, and there, resting safely inside a small glass box on the workbench, was the silver thread. It still shimmered softly whenever the morning light touched it. Thomas picked up the tiny treasure with great care. "It reminds me," he said quietly, "that miracles never truly belong to those who receive them." Margaret smiled. "They belong to everyone whose heart is willing to share them." Thomas nodded. "Then let us do exactly that." And from that day forward, the little workshop became more than a place where shoes were made. It became a place where kindness lived. Whenever a child arrived with worn-out shoes and empty pockets, Thomas quietly measured their feet and made a sturdy new pair without asking for payment. When an elderly traveler could not afford winter boots, Thomas smiled and simply said, "Pay me with a story from your travels." When a young apprentice wished to learn the craft, Thomas welcomed him into the workshop, teaching him every lesson his own father had once taught him. "Never rush a stitch," he would say. "A careless shoe may wound a foot, but a careful shoe may carry someone safely home." Many apprentices came through his door. Some stayed for months, others for years. Before each of them left, Thomas offered the same final lesson. The finest leather is not enough. The sharpest tools are not enough. The strongest thread is not enough. If your hands are not guided by kindness, your work will never truly be complete. The apprentices never forgot those words. As the years passed, Margaret became known throughout the valley for her warm heart. No traveler ever left her home hungry. Every Christmas, she filled baskets with bread, warm blankets, and handmade clothes for families who struggled through the harsh winters. She never spoke of generosity as though it were something extraordinary. To her, it was simply the right thing to do. The little village slowly changed. Neighbors began helping neighbors more often. Farmers shared extra harvests. Carpenters repaired broken fences without expecting payment. Children learned that small acts of kindness could brighten someone's darkest day. Even strangers felt welcome. And though no one could explain exactly why, the village seemed happier with every passing year. One spring afternoon, many years later, Thomas stood beneath the old oak tree. Its branches were larger now. Its roots stretched deeper into the earth. Birds nested among its leaves. Children played beneath its shade. Thomas gently rested his hand upon its ancient trunk. "I wonder where our little friends are now," he whispered. A soft breeze stirred the leaves above him. For just a moment, he thought he heard distant laughter, light, cheerful, familiar. He smiled. "I hope you've found another workshop." Another breeze danced through the branches. A single oak leaf floated gently into his hand. Thomas tucked it carefully into his pocket, not as proof, for no proof was needed, but as a reminder. Some gifts cannot be seen, some friendships leave no footprints. Yet, they remain with us forever. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the western hills, Thomas returned to the workshop. His newest apprentice had just finished stitching a simple pair of shoes. The young man looked uncertain. "They're not perfect." Thomas examined them carefully. He smiled. "They're honest. And honest work always grows better with patience." The apprentice looked relieved. "How did you become such a good shoemaker?" Thomas glanced toward the little glass box where the silver thread still rested. For a moment, memories filled his heart. Tiny footsteps, moonlit laughter, beautiful shoes upon an empty workbench. Then he looked back at the young apprentice. "I had wonderful teachers." The apprentice glanced around the room. "I've never met them," Thomas smiled. "No, but perhaps—" He looked toward the old oak tree outside the window. "One day you will." Years passed gently, as all years do. Thomas and Margaret grew older. Their hair turned silver. Their hands became slower. But their smiles remained warm. Whenever children visited the workshop, Thomas would sit beside the fire and tell them a story. Not of riches, not of kings, not of mighty battles. He told them about two tiny friends who came in the quiet of the night. Friends who expected nothing. Friends who worked with joy. Friends who taught a poor shoemaker that kindness is the greatest craft of all. Some children believed every word. Others smiled politely, thinking it was only a fairy tale. Thomas never argued. He simply winked and said, "The best stories always leave a little room for wonder." Many years later, after Thomas and Margaret had lived long, peaceful, and happy lives, the little workshop remained standing beside the ancient oak tree. New generations of shoemakers worked there. The tools were carefully passed down. The lessons were never forgotten. And every Christmas Eve, the newest shoemaker would place a tiny pair of beautifully made shoes upon the windowsill, not because anyone expected the elves to return, but because gratitude should never be forgotten. Travelers who passed through the valley often asked why such a tiny pair of shoes stood in the window each winter. The villagers would smile. Some would simply say, "It is an old tradition." Others would whisper, "It is a thank you." And if a traveler happened to pass the workshop very late, on a snowy Christmas night, when the moon shone brightly above the ancient oak, when every candle had gone out, when the whole village slept peacefully, they might hear, just for a moment, the faintest sound, tap, 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 like tiny footsteps dancing upon old wooden floors. Perhaps it was only the wind, perhaps it was only the branches swaying together, or perhaps, somewhere in the world, two joyful little elves had found another humble workshop, another honest craftsperson, another heart in need of hope, because true kindness never disappears, it simply finds a new home. And so, the story of the little shoemaker and the Christmas elves was told from one generation to the next, not as a tale about magic, not as a story about impossible wonders, but as a gentle reminder that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can change a life. A generous heart can restore hope, a grateful spirit can inspire miracles, and the greatest gifts we ever receive are often the ones we never expected. So, if you ever find yourself walking through a quiet village on a snowy winter evening, and you pass a tiny workshop glowing with warm candlelight, take a moment to smile, for somewhere, hidden beyond what our eyes can see, kindness may still be quietly at work. I'm ending the story here. You may not be awake right now. Stay tuned by subscribing to the channel to hear more such stories in the future.